Welcome to How to Think and Act Like a UX Librarian, a part of a series of online discussions brought to you by the ACRL University Library Section Professional Development Committee. I am Grace Koletsky-Maisel, a member of the committee. I'll be moderating this program along with my colleagues Chris Miller and Jason Martin. This is one of an ongoing series of online programs sponsored by our committee, and at the end of the session, I will give you more information about upcoming programs. This session is being recorded, and when the recording is ready, we will send the link to the video to everyone who registered for the program. The program today will consist of approximately 45 minutes of presentation from our panelists, followed by a question and answer session. Please put your questions in the chat box, and we will collect all of them and answer as many as we can at the end. We will post a link to the program assessment in the chat box after the Q&A session. Please take a few moments to give us your feedback on today's program. With those announcements out of the way, I'm very happy to start today's program. We are joined today by three panelists. They are Rebecca Blackiston, UX Strategist at University of Arizona Libraries, Josh Boyer, Department Head UX at NCSU Libraries, and Emily Daly, Head of Assessment and UX at Duke University Libraries. And without further delay, I'll hand it over to our panel.
Okay, hi, thanks, Grace. I'm Rebecca Blackiston, and this is the second, as Grace mentioned, of a series. So we did do some pretty significant introductions in our first session, so we're going to keep these pretty brief. But just if you're not familiar with what I've done in my background, this is actually my 15th year in libraries. I just realized last week I'm entering my 15th year. I started out in public services, reference, and instruction. In 2010, I moved on to website product management, overseeing our website steering group and our web team. I did a lot of work on content strategy, usability testing. By 2014, I'd moved into a restructured web design and user experience department that I oversaw. And then just last year, a month after the first of this series of this panel, I was moved into administration as our user experience strategist. So I'm now working beyond just the website and looking at user experience a little bit more broadly across the library, and also tying it into our strategic planning and our assessment efforts for the library. So that's an exciting new role. Things I love to do: user research of all sorts, usability testing probably still being my favorite, plain language and writing with clarity, both on the website and in our signage and our emails and everything that we write as we communicate with our audience, questioning assumptions and rethinking sort of everything that we do as a big part of the user experience work. So that's my brief introduction, and I'll pass it off to Josh, who's next alphabetically.
Hello, everyone. I'm Josh Boyer. I'm the head of the User Experience Department at North Carolina State University Libraries. Our libraries runs the library website. We contribute, along with a couple of other departments, to the Ask Us service desk and chat service. We host the library's cross-departmental user research team. That means doing usability tests, interviews, surveys, and focus groups. And we also play a role in facilitating the use of some of the visualization spaces at our libraries. I've been here at NC State a long time. I've been here since 1999. And before library school, I was a newspaper reporter. So now let's meet Emily.
Thanks, Josh. So as Grace said, I'm head of assessment and user experience at the Duke University Libraries. I started at Duke over 11 years ago as an instruction librarian, and like many instruction librarians, I got really tired of teaching students how to use bad interfaces. So at that point, I worked with library IT staff to get feedback from users and advocate for changes to our web interfaces. I had no background in usability testing or UX research. I learned as I went, read a lot of books, and found it really interesting. And this eventually led to an opportunity to lead the library's website team, which I still do today. After a couple of years of leading the web team, I realized how much of the UX work we were doing online connected to the library's physical spaces, collections, and services. So at that point, I advocated for creating a small UX department that would consider not only web design and interfaces, but also the library's services and physical spaces. From there, we evolved into the Department of Assessment and User Experience because I feel assessment is so closely tied to UX. We can't make improvements for our students and faculty until we learn about their needs and assess how well things are working to begin with. And of course, good UX requires assessment to ensure that the changes you've made are actually working in the way you intended for them to. Before coming to Duke, I taught high school English. I worked as a teen librarian in a public library in Wyoming, and I worked as a high school librarian here in Durham, North Carolina. All of these experiences inform the current work I do with users here at Duke, for sure. So now that we've given some brief introductions, we'll move into our questions. As Grace mentioned, Josh, Rebecca, and I have about 45 minutes worth of content prepared with about 5 questions we've prepared for answers for. And then after we go through those, we'll open it up to the audience for your questions. So first up is, what's an easy way to get started doing UX? And Rebecca, why don't you start us out? Rebecca, we're not hearing you if you're trying to talk. Maybe Josh wants to go? Oh, perfect.
Sorry, I was on mute. I forgot I'd muted myself, and sorry about that. So I'll start over. So I was going to explain this photo that's on the slide and why I put this here. Last year, we did a library-wide design thinking project where we got people from across the library in all different types of roles, librarian staff, public services, back-end developers, the whole range of staff, to start thinking a little bit more like user experience librarians. So one of the things that we did as part of that initial training is we had those staff members in small teams of 3 go out on campus and start talking to people. And this is something that we do anyway in many of our jobs as librarians, but not sort of in an intentional manner where we're really deeply listening and asking questions about their experiences. So this is a photo of Monique and Cindy and Joan, who have their little name tags on, going out in front of the library and talking with a graduate student and hearing about her experience using the library. And then they would bring that information back and share it with the other staff. So just for that general idea of going and talking to people and starting to listen a lot more closely to what they're saying, and trying to avoid inserting ourselves, and sort of practicing that in your everyday life as you're doing your job is a really easy way to kind of get started. I'll pass it off to Josh.
So I'll take this in a different direction. One easy way to get started is journey mapping. So a journey map asks you to plot all the steps that a user will go through over time to use a service. So for example, in 2013, we started a 3D printing service. And so the journey map made us think through all the steps that a user would take. So finding out about the service, reading about the service on our website, coming to the library, either prepared with the right kind of file to give to us or not, finding the makerspace where this happens, which is on the 4th floor of one of our libraries, and then paying for it on the 2nd floor. You can see how this kind of gets exhausting, but this is us trying to put ourselves in the shoes of the user. Receiving an email from us the next day and coming back to pick up the 3D prints later, and possibly even needing to start the process all over again if the print job didn't work the way the patron was imagining. So writing out all those steps on a linear timeline made us really see that each patron that we encounter in who's going to use the service has put days into this and at least 2 trips to the library into their project. And it helps us see that anything we can do, any efficiencies we can work in, will really save the user's time. We use a journey map template that you can find on a website called the Learning Space Toolkit. There's lots of journey map templates out there, but the Learning Space Toolkit one is the one we've been using. So a danger of journey mapping is that you still haven't talked to any users yet. You haven't done what Rebecca and her colleagues are doing. And you do have to do that. You have to talk to users. But journey mapping can be one good place to start. So now let's hear from Emily.
Yeah, and Josh, my example is similar. I didn't apply the terminology journey mapping, but again, it's very similar. So my advice here is just to try something in your library that you've never actually done before. Maybe you've never actually reserved a group study room from start to finish or used the self-checkout station. Go through the steps as you would if you didn't work in the library. If you would normally ask for help, then do that, but don't use any of your insider library knowledge. Notice what you notice. What works well? What's really hard? What do you and your colleagues have control over changing? If you identify some no-brainer kinds of changes that would make whatever process you tried a lot easier, go ahead and try to make improvement. Of course, it's really important to work with your colleagues along the way as you make changes and to inform others if necessary. And as Josh indicated, it's likely you'll want more information than you can get from just your experience. So at this point, you'll want to begin talking to users about how they go through the steps of reserving a room or using a self-checkout station. See how they approach the same task that you just completed. And once you feel like you have a pretty good handle on the biggest issues, maybe you've talked to a couple of graduate students, a couple of undergrads, some faculty members, you have your own experience to draw on, at that point you're probably ready to involve more colleagues in seeing what you can change. When you're just getting started with UX research, you'll likely be most successful if you start with something fairly defined and contained, and something you know you and your colleagues have some control over changing. You'll be even more successful if you choose a service or a space that others also view as problematic and have an investment in fixing. And don't forget as you go along to take screenshots or pictures. It'll be much easier to describe the problems you and your users encountered if you have evidence to back up your findings and recommendations. And as in Josh's example, usually there are so many steps along the way, it's easy to forget what you've experienced along the way, so it's important to document every step if you can. And I also want to underscore what Rebecca said about the importance of getting out of your office and talking to users. That is my very favorite way to move my library colleagues past lots of conversation and conjecturing about what we think our users need and want to a point where we can actually begin making decisions based on user feedback. When we're arguing over what we should do differently, I often will try to stop the conversation by saying, hey guys, rather than spinning our wheels talking about this, let's go ahead and begin asking some users. So Josh and Rebecca, I think you had a couple other things about this question with maybe some pictures.
Yeah, some advice that we've talked about is to start observing workarounds that users have, the ways that they hack. So in this case, the library building to make it do what they need it to do. The photo here is from Rebecca's library. People obviously really want to keep this door open. At my library, one of the common workarounds that we see is directional signs that are made by users. So on the one hand, we do take those down because this is not a signage design free-for-all. We are in charge after all. But we do pay attention to what it is the people making these ad hoc signs, what is it they need? What are they having to work around? So this is a notion of just keeping your eyes open to what are your users doing in your building. And Rebecca has some more ideas about keeping your eyes open.
Yeah, and it's an interesting, it actually ties back into what Emily was talking about in immersing yourself in the end user experience. We've done a lot of immersion activities, and the example on the previous slide was one of the rooms that was for faculty to use, and we decided, let's do our UX team meeting in this public-facing room. Let's reserve it. Let's use the technology. And we documented that entire experience. We took photos, and then we shared it with the people in charge of that room to see, are there little pain points that we could improve upon. And yeah, the example of the door, we wanted to keep the door open because we had someone coming who didn't have access to the code, and we wanted to make sure it was open. But we've seen other people do that in a lot of different spaces in the library. So why can't we make doors that will stay open for people? We haven't experienced the signage hack. That's interesting, that directional signage. Haven't experienced that yet. So this is kind of a funny slide that Josh and I were both saying we need to put the slide in a presentation one day, and so here we are. So Josh and I were at an EDUI conference in Charlottesville last year, and we went with a number of colleagues out after the activities of the day to a tequila bar, and we noticed that they had these glasses that had this really interesting design element where if you accidentally knocked down your glass because you had maybe a little bit too much tequila, it was in this little wooden, I don't even know how you describe that, it wouldn't fall over, so you're not going to break the glass, which both saves, you know, the embarrassment of you as a tequila drinker in dropping that glass, but it also saves, you know, money, and it's an interesting design element. And so anytime you go with a bunch of UX librarians to a restaurant or a bar, you might notice that they criticize the menu, or they think about the wayfinding to get to the bathrooms, or they're looking at all of those little details. And so that's another way to really think about how to think like a UX person, is to pay attention to all of those little things in your life throughout your day. And it does really change the way that you think about your own experiences and pay more attention to those sorts of things. So I'm glad we got that image in there as that example.
We work hard.
Oh, I did. Oh, and I had some other things. I had some more serious things beyond this to talk about too. Some of it building off what's already been discussed, but incorporating those lightweight user interviews into your daily work, which I mentioned already, as a way to sort of build empathy for your end user in your daily life. And trying to ask those open-ended questions like, what are your biggest challenges and your barriers to success? So if you're a liaison librarian or a subject librarian, maybe you're meeting with faculty and grad students all the time, maybe just incorporate into those conversations a couple of questions that will dive a little bit deeper into their experiences and challenges and how we might be able to provide better services for them. And even if you're not actually doing an interview per se, sort of paying attention to those pain points and challenges of users, whether you're working on the reference desk or you're checking something out to a person, you're doing instruction and reference especially, you'll notice a lot of those. Both Emily and I did start in instruction and reference, and so we had a lot of those experiences, which is kind of what led both of us into UX. And another thing is, so if you're in a meeting and you're having a hard time making a decision in a group, and I think Emily mentioned this too, and it's something that's going to impact end users, is really just suggesting, well, let's go talk to the end user and solve this problem so you're not having stakeholders arguing over something to try to come to a decision, but you're basing the decision on the actual end user experience. So those are some other suggestions.
Cool. So I think we're ready for our next question now, which is how do I plan and lead a focus group? In the first part of this webinar on UX in libraries, there seemed to be quite a bit of interest in concrete UX research methods, so we decided to spend some time today talking about focus groups. And of course, we've already mentioned a couple of concrete methods with interviews and journey mapping, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about focus groups. And we chose this method because they tend to get a bad rap. There are definitely some UX researchers who would say never to do a focus group. They would tell you instead to rely only on individual interviews or journey mapping, but it's important to be realistic about the resources and the time that you have. Conducting 20 individual interviews requires more time than conducting 3 focus groups. And I think there are really good ways to get good stuff out of both types of research. The primary complaint about focus groups is that you run the risk of having one very vocal person dominate the conversation. Of course, that can happen, but there are ways to minimize the risk. One way to minimize the risk of having 1 or 2 participants dominate the focus group is to ask a mix of individual reflection questions and group discussion questions. Here's an example of a focus group that we did with first-generation college students in the fall. You'll see that we included opportunities for participants to think about questions on their own and record their thoughts on scratch paper, and to make lists of words or phrases on individual post-its. We collected and transcribed participants' handwritten notes, which provided some nice artifacts from the sessions for us to share with our colleagues. And by asking participants to reflect first on their experience and then share their thoughts with the whole group, we found that everyone started the group discussion from a more level playing field. The participants who tended to think quickly on their feet and rushed to be the first to talk were asked to reflect first, whereas the quieter participants had some time to think and reflect and prepare their thoughts, perhaps making them more likely to contribute. And because everyone had the opportunity to write down their thoughts, we had a way to ensure that everyone was heard, even if they didn't verbalize what they wrote. I think it's also really important if you want to make focus groups manageable and if you want to make a UX research program sustainable, you have to involve your colleagues and make it relatively easy for them to say yes. Your colleagues will likely not feel ready right away to moderate a focus group, but I find that most library staff are willing to take notes. We try to make this easy for them, but by providing a template like this one here. This also makes reviewing the notes and listening to the audio recordings later much easier. As we'll mention a number of times during today's session, we all really feel that UX research is truly the work of all library staff. And if you're trying to build a culture of assessment or a UX mindset in your library and get your colleagues excited about talking to end users, you have to try to involve them in research as frequently as possible. And I found that including my colleagues in a 1 or 1.5 hour focus group session is a really nice, low barrier way for them to get involved and hear firsthand some really rich information from users. And Rebecca, I think you're going to talk a little bit more about focus groups.
Yeah, and I completely agree on the idea of bringing in your colleagues, and we're doing something currently like Rooms and Spaces where we have a person from public services who's really closely tied to that service that's actually helping us do usability testing, and that it helps you make better decisions, that helps everyone have buy-in from the get-go. And it was also really exciting because he was one of the ones that actually suggested, let's go talk to users and help solve this problem. So that was really exciting too. I do think providing templates and that type of thing also make it easier, and it's to not have to worry as much about all the planning that can be involved in those types of things. So yeah, another, thinking about focus groups again, how do you make it a safe space so that everyone feels that they can contribute and that their voices are heard? Emily mentioned some of these examples already of giving the opportunity for people to write things down as opposed to necessarily vocalize them if they're not comfortable doing that. This is a great template that Emily provided about ground rules that they use for their focus group. So having those things up front to really kind of set the stage early on as you begin facilitating the conversation will really help people feel empowered to speak what's on their mind and also be heard. So strongly recommend you do that. Another thing that's useful is to make sure that you really have goals and a scope in mind. So what's the intention of the focus group? Are you trying to generate ideas? Are you trying to get feedback on a specific idea you have already? Are you trying to identify pain points or areas of opportunity? Are you trying to prioritize efforts? So maybe you have a lot going on and you really want to make sure you're focused on what matters most to users. But at the same time, you also want to allow people to wander a little bit and encourage a little bit more openness so that people don't feel as constrained or restricted in the types of things, because you might discover things that you didn't intend that are actually really useful and can help you move forward. So encouraging openness and wild ideas, but also keeping it scoped in a way that you know how to then analyze what you find out at the end of the day. So another way to encourage voices to be heard, if you look up brainwriting, that's a term that's sometimes used as an alternative to brainstorming, is really that ability to write things down. We did it wasn't really a focus group, it was called an open forum, where we invited campus to come in when we were embarking on some significant renovations to the library. And we had everyone, we gave everyone Post-its that were color-coded. Because there were 20 or 30 people in the room, it was hard to hear everyone's voice in that session, but we let them write down on color-coded Post-its the things they were most concerned about, the things they were most excited about, and then any questions that they had. So that was another way that we were able to gather a lot of information through that written approach. And people were more honest and open that way if they were critical or they were concerned about certain things that were personal to them. Another thing is to really encouraging people to build on the ideas of one another as part of that kind of exploratory building up the knowledge as part of the session. And then some common pitfalls to avoid. Becoming reactionary or defensive. It can be intuitive to want to insert your own knowledge into the conversation. A lot of times I've heard people who are newer to facilitating focus groups or having those types of feedback sessions say things like, oh, well, we tried that before, so we're not going to try it again, or we really can't do that because of X, Y, or Z. Or even saying things like, oh, yeah, we hear that a lot, can sound dismissive of the comments that people are sharing. So making sure you're not dismissive and you're open to all ideas and that all comments are valuable. So people do feel, again, that safe space. And also trying to avoid selling the library. This is something we found was a big challenge as the design thinking project activity last year, going out and talking to students about the library. Our gut reaction and our way of doing things in our daily work is often to sell the library and advocate for the library. And, oh, did you know we do this, and we do this, and we can help you with this? And that wasn't really the intention of the activity. The intention was to slow down and to listen to the end users. That's another part that can take some practice with focus groups as well.
Rebecca, I just want to chime in there. I think that advice is really good, and I will often at the beginning of a session with users say that my role in this case is just to listen and to remain neutral and not sell the library or share tips, but that I'll make a note to myself about things that come up during the discussion, the interview, the focus group, whatever it might be, that I think would be really useful at the end. And then during the last minute or so of our focus group, I'll just return to that list, or maybe if we don't have time, I'll email users afterward just to say, oh, by the way, check out this link, or this service might be really helpful for you. But I definitely separate the two roles. I want students to know about these great features, but I don't want it to interrupt the flow of the focus group. So that's kind of a way of being able to both sell the library and remain neutral.
Yeah, and there's a similar thing with usability testing. Oh, sorry, Josh. For usability testing, where you're observing someone trying to use your website, and I mean, if they're struggling to find a piece of information or they're not aware of a service or that type of thing, we can be really tempted to insert ourselves and say, oh, well, actually, you know, you can, if you click on that link, you would find this thing, and really holding and having that self-control and waiting until the very end of the session is a similar type of thing. Yeah. Josh.
I want to endorse the advice that Emily and Rebecca have been giving. I just used it 2 hours ago in a focus group. We had a really excellent focus group facilitator, and she has moved on to other things, and so I found myself as the most qualified person 2 hours ago, so I did it. And I did it just using what Emily and Rebecca were talking about, giving out paper for people to write on, and not exactly what Rebecca was just saying, not pointing out to, when a student says, oh, I wish the library had this, my job is not to say we do have that. My job is to listen and say, oh, okay, why? Tell me more. Why would you want to use that? What would, you know, how would that work? And so anyway, I just followed their advice and had a really good focus group just today.
Cool. I want to mention too, we didn't have this question, but a couple of tools to get started. I would highly recommend buying Post-it notes in various colors and colored Sharpie markers. I find myself going to those as my go-to tools all the time, and they're not expensive supplies, but it's amazing what people will do when you hand them a colored Sharpie marker and Post-it notes. You'll get all kinds of feedback from them that can be really useful to code and look at later. So if you're looking for some tools to get you started, I would highly recommend those. And I think now we're ready for our next question.
So I will talk about this. So the question is, aren't we just researching how students use the library? And do we have to do more? So I want to tell a story, which is years ago, a colleague taught me to understand better how the library fits into students' lives, that what they do in the library, the part that we can see, has this larger context that it's helpful to learn as much as we can about that context. There was a particular chemistry assignment that all of those of us who worked the reference desk, so now I'm referring to this setup in my library that doesn't exist anymore, but anyway, all of us who worked there knew about this chemistry assignment, and we had taught each other how to do it, and we learned how to help students with the tricky parts of the assignment. What we didn't learn, what we never figured out until my colleague found out, and by talking to students and talking to the professor and talking to students some more, was how little the assignment counted towards students' grades. And when he told us that, everything started to make sense. We all knew how tricky this was. We all knew that it was actually even a little bit difficult for us. And suddenly, the behavior of the students started to make sense. They were flying through the assignment. They tended to do it at the last minute. Our explanations of the complicated reference tools for doing this work, you know, some of them were interested in, a lot of them were not. And when my colleague explained that it was such a tiny part of the grade, it just all made sense. And so we had focused on the literal questions students were asking. We had focused on the library part too much and not enough on students' real lives. So now let's hear from Rebecca.
Good story, Josh.
Yeah, so I mean, it's true that a lot of times we're in our library worlds and we sort of don't have that broader context of what's really going on in students' lives, especially. So this is an image from also this design thinking project I've referenced a couple times. We had design thinking teams prototype solutions to our users' biggest problems, and we had them kind of think big and broad. So this is an example where they created a smart dashboard that was customized per student based on things like their major, whether they're on campus or off campus, all of those types of pieces of data that we have on campus about our end users, but we haven't really taken advantage of or used in any significant way yet. So they had these different systems, including our course management system, our UA profiles information, all these different systems kind of talking to each other and looking at ways to customize the experience for Josh and Jane, who were the two personas that they came up with, that were students at different levels with different majors and different experiences, and they demonstrated how it could be different for one person or the other person. But they brought in that broader picture of it's not just about the library. Maybe Josh, which isn't this Josh, this other guy Josh, maybe this Josh isn't interested either in what the library is doing, but they're interested in how can I get help with my assignment tonight, and how can I make sure that I turn my paper in on time, and all these other things that are integrated into their larger academic life beyond the library. So I wanted to sort of show that example. There were several other examples from the Design Thinking Project that did something similar. So we have one team developed the Wildcat Meetup app, where it was connecting researchers that have similar interests across campus, which isn't something the library does now, but no one on campus is doing it, and maybe the library could play a really key role in actually doing that for our researchers on campus. Something that we actually did last semester, which I talked about in the session last time, but it's evolved since then, so it's kind of exciting to actually see how it's evolved in the last few months. We did this research lifecycle project where we did interviews with faculty and some card sorting to figure out how to display information on our website related to support for researchers. And at that time, we were really focused on the library services that support researchers. But we realized through the process that it's not necessarily about the library, it's about all of the services that support researchers during the research lifecycle. So now we are actually partnering with our research and discovery and innovation department on campus, which is sort of our Office of Research. And they have a larger research gateway, and we're trying to tie in information to that larger picture, which is actually where researchers tend to go. They don't tend to go to the library website. So we're actually working and partnering with them now on that effort, which is really exciting. So again, thinking beyond just what the library does on that broader user journey and life cycle. We'll go on to the next question.
So one of my roles at the library is to coordinate 2 student advisory boards, one for undergraduates and one for graduate students. I run the monthly meetings as a modified focus group / usability study / interview. I ask about all kinds of topics ranging from how students use the printers in the library to how best to market various services to undergraduates. And as Josh and Rebecca had indicated, I nearly always approach a topic from outside the library. For instance, I would never start by asking students what their favorite study spots are in the library, even if that's what I really care about knowing. Instead, I start by asking where students like to study and have them rattle off or maybe write down on Post-its all of their favorite spots. I then ask what they like about these spots and that might lead to a discussion about how they use one spot for writing papers and another spot for studying biochem and yet another spot for group projects. I might also learn that students can access some really nice classroom space after hours, or that the Student Center has an entrance that's really hard to access at night and feels unsafe. This all feeds into my larger understanding of a topic that's very important to students, study space. The library will probably come up naturally at some point, but if it doesn't, I've just learned a valuable piece of information, and that is that students can spend 10 minutes talking about their favorite study spaces without even mentioning the library, which I would take as a serious warning sign. At that point, I would likely ask open-ended questions about library study spaces, but I'd use what I learned from the first part of our conversation to contextualize their comments. And our conversation would likely look very different than if I'd started by asking, what is your favorite place to study in the library, which makes all kinds of assumptions. And as my colleagues here have said, I can't emphasize enough the importance of getting outside the library and being part of the campus culture. Read the campus newspaper, subscribe to email lists that you know students actually read, be aware of how students you never talk to perceive the library and how it fits into the larger context of life as a student or a faculty member. So with that, why don't we move to our next question, which is how much user research do I have to do?
Yeah, so some, always some, never none. It doesn't always have to be that intensive to really get some useful information that's going to help inform your decision making. I wanted to recommend a book called Just Enough Research by Erica Hall that gets at some of this, of how much research do you really have to do, and of course it's all context dependent, but always try to do a little bit of something. So this is a photo from our tiny cafe, which we just started doing last fall, based on Zoe Chow actually presented on her UX cafe that she does at Penn State at a conference last year that inspired us to do something similar, where it's basically a pop-up cafe. We have a sign, we have a tablecloth. I like this example in this photo because we actually took it on the road and went to the Health Sciences Library for this event, where we're usually at the main library. So we all got golf cart training on the UX team, and I've been driving around campus with our sign and our tablecloth and our bag of snacks and a Keurig maker that I got at a Goodwill. So we have a very cheap lightweight way to get students, especially who are wandering through the library, to stop for a few minutes and talk with us and give us some feedback. This was a user interview with a graduate student in public health. So a 10-minute interview can really give you a lot of insight. Where students struggle, how the library supports their learning and their success. There was a really good example actually from last week. Now that Tiny Cafe has been going on for a couple months, we're trying to get stakeholders involved in stopping by and using this as a tool for them and their work. So we had our front-end developer who's been working on our redesign of our database of databases on our website. And they had a number of different prototypes, and we're trying to think through, is this design too different from our current website design? Is it too jarring? And they couldn't really decide among the development team how far they should go into our intended new design that we haven't really implemented across the rest of the website yet. So he spent 30 minutes, actually probably less than 30 minutes because there was a travel time, so maybe 20 to 25 minutes. He spoke with 3 different students and had them go through his prototype on his laptop, and was able to get enough information from those 3 students to go back to the development team and say, everyone was really familiar and they thought they had used the new database of databases, not even noticing the redesign at all. So it's kind of fascinating. It looked exactly like our branding of our main campus website, so it had that familiarity around it. There are also a lot of little things that he noticed as they were going through the interface to make little micro changes to design, like the way a button was styled or the way a link was underlined to improve upon. And again, less than 30 minutes, he gathered all that information. So I think that's just a really good example of how 10, 20 minutes of your time can help inform decisions. Josh?
That's great. That's a good 20 minutes.
Yeah. He said it was the best 20 minutes of the week. He thought it was just, he's like, I want to be back here every week doing this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a really pragmatic approach to considering how much user research that we have to do. We're going to, if we're going to do user research, we're proud. The likely result is that we're going to try to we're going to come up with some recommendations to change, even something like Rebecca was talking about, change a button, change a link. And so I consider, who are we going to need to persuade? And so if the decision maker that we need to persuade to change something, we don't know, you don't know before the user research, but after the user research, you want to change that button. So if the decision maker is me or a colleague who's really, I'm actually helping a colleague who is very excited to get feedback from a usability test we'll do next month. And so I don't think he's excited to get feedback. He has developed an interface and he wants to know how it is. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a usability test with 3 to 5 people. We're not going to record it. We're just going to take some notes. It's going to, the amount of effort we're going to put into this is just enough. And we'll create minimalist documentation of what we found and the results. But let's say that this is not the case. I'm making this one up for us. But let's say that what we were going to do research on was the interlibrary loan service. In that one, there are lots of stakeholders. It's complicated. And any changes that we would recommend would not be cheap or easy. And so, and furthermore, hypothetically, let's imagine there's a skeptical decision maker in this process who may not want to spend time or money on improvements. So again, we could do a web usability test, but this time let's record the sessions so we can show the stakeholders what it looks like when people are struggling or confused or going in the wrong direction or failing to click a button. And we may want to interview researchers and record those sessions as well. And so this time we would put more emphasis on writing a report. We still don't want to write a long report, more on that later. But we do want to write it carefully in order to make the recommendations persuasive to whoever the decision makers are. So now let's hear from Emily.
Yeah, I agree fully with you guys. I think it's important to consider your budget, your resources, your needs. I'm a big fan of attaching modifieds to the front of user research methods. So I might not be able to conduct a rigorous scientific study every time, and that may in fact not be necessary. I find it's very rarely necessary to conduct rigorous scientific studies. Instead, I develop a modified photo diary study or a modified contextual inquiry. And relatedly, my colleagues and I try to look at an issue in as many ways as possible. So we'll conduct a paper-based or an online survey, or perhaps even both if appropriate. We might do a modified focus group, a usability study, a space study, a physical observation. We might have an advisory board discussion. We might look at web analytics, analyze existing data. As you can see, the list goes on. We triangulate these methods for more effective, robust, and informed UX research. This presents more opportunities to involve our colleagues in the research process and leads to more artifacts and data to share with your colleagues when you recommend changes and improvements. You might have a colleague complain that you only talk to 6 users during a usability study, but it will be harder to argue with your findings if you conduct an observational study, talk directly to users, and put out a paper survey in the space that you're studying. But again, it's important to consider how much data you really need. It might not be necessary to do 4 of these studies or data collection methods for an issue. It's really important to consider what you need, what your stakeholders are going to listen to, and what you can reasonably do with the resources that you have, and do a little bit, as you said, Rebecca, more or something is always better than nothing at all, which takes us to our next question. We have all this great research. Now what?
So I'll start on this one. So it's tempting to think that now that you have all this great research, you need to fix everything. And I want to stress, again, some pragmatism. It's useful to remember to just try to improve something. And I'll throw a baseball analogy into this, that when we're not sure if we can hit a home run, let's just try to get to first base. So I'll give you an example of some of my thinking and my baseball metaphor. So we know from several user research efforts that one of the main problems we have at NC State Libraries with our room reservation system is no-show reservations, when people reserve and then just don't show up, and then cause confusion for the people who are in the building where the reservation is online but there's no one in the room, or the wrong people in the room. So we know that. How do we know this? We know this from a couple of systematic observational studies. We know this from complaints at the service desk. We know from looking at the logs. We know that there are a few students who reserve just a tremendous amount of hours, despite we do have rules, but these students go to the max and reserve more hours every week than any human could actually spend in the library. And so we really feel like we've got a lot of great research now. What do we do with it? So we'd love to solve this once and for all, but we know that we can't, in my baseball metaphor, we can't hit a home run right now. For various reasons, we can't treat the rooms like a hotel would, which is, lock the doors and staff every single reservation. That's not practical. The system needs to be self-service. So let's imagine hitting a triple. A triple might be something like having patrons confirm their reservations on a device once they get to the room. We like this kind of thinking. We kind of want to do it someday, but we're not ready. So now let's think about what would be a little less than that. What would hitting a double in my baseball metaphor be? That might be sending text messages to ask patrons to confirm their reservations the way that restaurants and hairstylists and others do. At this moment, there are reasons, and I'll just skip them for now. It's not realistic for us to do any of those things. So what we're doing is we're settling for hitting a single. We've just started having our room reservation system send emails 4 hours before reservations. The emails have this easy cancellation button, and so we're going to see if that makes a dent in the problem, and if it does, great, and either way, we'll evaluate from there. Basically, we consider ourselves now on first base, and we'll see if we can get to second. How about you, Rebecca?
Cool. I just wrote down that idea because we have that same problem. Like, how are you solving that? So we might try that too. We've had that same exact problem with rooms. And it's just interestingly, so this what's on the screen here is our results from some LibCal usability testing from last year when we first implemented LibCal. And it's nice because LibCal is so user-friendly that more people are booking rooms, but that means that less people are showing up because it's so easy to book rooms. And I guess it's difficult to cancel them, so there you go. So until last year, most of all of our data that we collected was in Word documents. And then I hired an amazing graduate assistant, Christina, So shout out to Christina, and she started using Airtable to track all of our data. So we now have all of our user research data in a much more organized fashion, which is great. So we do have it collected kind of all in one place. You can see in this example we have the type of testing, what was the device they were using, how many attempts did it take to complete the task, what was the time on task. There's a great way to manipulate data and like sort it and use it in these tables. So Airtable's been really helpful for us as far as actually keeping and compiling all of this data in one place, so that's been useful. So the raw data is great, but we have found that it's a lot to digest for stakeholders, and yeah, again, like what do you do with all of this information? So if we go to the next slide, something that we've done is we have a template now for our, primarily usability testing findings and recommendations. And one of the things we started doing is prioritizing the issues and then kind of coming up with recommendations to discuss with stakeholders, assuming that the decision-making doesn't actually lie with the team that's doing the testing, which it doesn't always, or it does require some consultation with stakeholders or decision-makers to move things forward. So rather than having a big, long bullet list of all the things, we've tried to sort of focus down on what's most important and most impactful to users and what are some possibilities of how to address those things. So this is just a screenshot of that template, again, from LibCal. So this was taking the data in that table form and then making sense of it, talking through it, coming up with a list of issues, and prioritizing them in some kind of order based on user impact. So that's been really helpful for us. And again, like Josh said, there's going to be things that you can't necessarily do. Some of the recommendations here are not technically feasible, or they require working with SpringShare, for example. But there are some examples. There's actually one that just a couple weeks ago went live in LibCal. I don't know who has LibCal and who might have noticed this, but we found in usability testing that having the color coding underneath the calendar display was a usability issue because you wouldn't know what the colors meant until you scroll down to the bottom of the page. Especially on mobile, this was problematic. Now the color coding is at the top of the table so you can see it before you see the room information. And that's because of this report that we sent to SpringShare. So that's kind of a cool example of, it might take a while, but potentially we can work with vendors, we can improve upon these things together. So.
Very cool. And we just have one last slide for this question. If we can advance or we can show that, but I want to make sure we get to our Q&A for our audience. We said we would stop at 1:45 Central. So let's go ahead and start with our Q&A from audience.
I am going to let Chris handle this. We had a couple, well, actually one specific question about the screenshot that was on a couple of slides ago. Rebecca, was that Airtables that was a screenshot of? Okay, all right, that's that we were curious about that. So I'll let Chris take over the rest of the questions.
And was that Airtables that was on the one that on the screen that Josh had displayed? Now I have good research. What do I do?
Yes.
That was the same. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we did have a couple of questions about scope, I guess, or what does a small library do for UX when you're the only librarian or one of two or three, and you don't have a whole team to support? And then there was another sort of similar that was from a MLS student who works part-time and doesn't have much authority to do UX work, and so how you would get experience in that regard. If you have any comments or about either of those.
I have a book recommendation for the first person who, the first question about what do I do if I have a really small department or no department at all and have only half a person who can do this kind of work. And I think it's a good book for those of us who even have more resources. It's the User Experience Team of One by Leah Bewley. And she goes through methods for doing UX, getting started as a really small, in a really small way. So I highly recommend that book. Rebecca or Josh, do you have anything else to add? I can add a couple other things, but I want to make sure you guys have a chance to.
I also recommend that book. It's a great book. Something I was thinking of is, depending on your campus, there could be, and maybe you only have yourself as a full-time staff member, but if you have the opportunity to hire student workers or graduate assistants or even interns, since we've done some more campus UX-y stuff, we've made a lot more connections on campus and are realizing there's a big need for learning about user experience work. It's a growing field. So people in the MIS department are now working on Google Analytics projects for us. We have a volunteer who's coming once a week to Tiny Cafe just to get the experience because he's going to graduate and is interested in moving into the UX field. So seeking out those types of opportunities, I think there's a lot of students when we're working in academic libraries, we have that access, and that's one approach as well.
Yeah, on the volunteer front, we have an undergraduate student who reached out to me to say that he wants some experience, and so we're very happy to have him. I mean, the first time he'll be a note taker, and if he's great and enthusiastic, then we'll get him to facilitate something. And so for someone looking to just get some experience, I would recommend doing what the student did, which is just find somewhere, the academic library, the Office of Information Technology, whoever you think might be doing it, they might be, and they might be very excited to have a note taker.
I've also had success with recruiting students from programs like psychology and neuroscience, social psychology, fields where PhD students might have gotten in and realized they don't want to do research for the rest of their lives in a lab. They really want a more applied setting, and so they find it really refreshing to be able to come to a setting where we are doing more applied work and actually implementing findings and recommendations on a faster scale or at a faster pace than perhaps in academia. Other areas of academia, so that's been successful too. And then one student or one person mentioned maybe not having the authority to do UX research. I think you can be pretty sneaky about doing UX research in a way that helps create buy-in. So I think it's really important always to talk to colleagues about problems and then see about working with them to implement some of the lightweight methods that we talked about today. And you can kind of very organically get people excited about talking to end users and then implementing recommendations based on what you found without necessarily saying, okay, we're now going to go out and do UX research, or I'm going to make myself into the UX librarian. As you've heard from Josh and Rebecca and me, we all came about this very organically and naturally. It's not as if one day we decided we were going to be the UX librarian. We just started doing this work and involving more and more of our colleagues, and then eventually we're able to advocate for positions or departments around it. So I hope that helps answer your questions.
Great. Another question that came in was around the IRB. Do you need to get IRB approval for each user research study / focus group?
So that answer is always, it depends on your institution. I can tell you what we have here at Duke, and then I'm sure Josh and Rebecca's experience is a little bit different here, or with their organizations. But at Duke, we repeatedly reach out to the IRB when we're doing major studies we know we want to present on to make them aware. We are almost always told that we don't have to go through the full IRB, that what we're doing is program evaluation. We're not trying to generalize research to a broader audience, and so what we're doing is fine, and we don't have to go through IRB. For usability studies, we've just gotten kind of a blanket pass on that because that's truly just program improvement. We're not, again, generalizing our study, and so we never go through IRB for usability. But like I said, just to cover ourselves, about once a year, we check back in just to make sure that we're all still in agreement about what we actually need to do in terms of protocols, and then whenever we're doing something new or very large scale, like a biennial survey that's going to go to thousands of students and faculty, we check in to be sure that we're still in compliance. So the best approach is just to ask, but not to be scared off by IRB.
Yeah, and ours is pretty much the same as Emily's, that, yeah, it's program evaluation for the most part. We're not generalizing. We don't have to go through IRB. We have gone through IRB when one example is a larger scale usability study that a librarian was doing on her sabbatical, and she had a much larger set of data, and she was planning to publish it, and it was released the Guide on the Side tool, and so it could be really useful for other librarians because that is something that's used across other libraries. But when it's for our website internally, we don't go through IRB for that.
Yeah, and exactly what Emily and Rebecca have said applies to us too, and we check in with IRB, and they keep telling us the same thing. And we actually do publish very short reports on our studies, and the key to that is that we do not make any bold claims that we have figured out something. We have research findings about graduate students in engineering. Instead, we say, we talked to some graduate students in engineering, and they told us that they would really love it if we had more powerful computers. And so we, the libraries, think maybe we should look into that. So that's our experience.
Great. Another question that came in was around organizational culture. which the question was, just wondering if you've ever had internal pushback when attempting to assess a UX problem. For instance, is there a perception that assessment equals criticism?
We've been lucky that we don't have that happen as much anymore. I think having user experience housed in our administration and tied to strategic planning has helped shift the culture a little bit. We sort of have a culture of feedback and criticism where it's accepted, and I think maybe we're lucky that way, but it doesn't come as a personal criticism of anyone or any services. I think the way you frame your results and frame your recommendations, it's important not to point things at anybody, but to really focus on the end user experience and what we discover through users, and not being critical in the language that you're using. But I think maybe we've been lucky that way.
I think it's also pretty critical to involve your colleagues from the beginning, so not to make it look like assessment is happening to them, but that you are assessing and doing UX research with them in collaboration, and hear from the beginning what their problems and pain points are. They often see these things firsthand in their work, and so we can also frame the work we're doing as having a positive impact on our end users, but also having a positive impact on workflows and staff ways of doing things. So that's not to say that there aren't people who've been around for a long time and have done things the same way and want to continue doing the same things the same way, but in general, I think if you approach the work collaboratively, you'll be more successful.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, and I was just going to ask if you could each share with us one cool thing you've been able to do as a result of UX research.
I'll share the really recent one from last week, because they happen all the time. But I thought it was really cool that we have a planned redesign, rebranding of our website that's been sort of a long time coming, and we have a pattern library that our designer created with all new sort of branding and navigation design and everything pretty different, and that we were able to push forward that redesign of our database of databases, which I think is going to have an incredible impact on users, and it's responsive to phones and that type of thing. It's actually a standalone PHP application, so we had the opportunity to do a totally different design and have it not influence the main website. And so the fact that users felt it was familiar, it's taking our standalone application that's looks kind of the same for about 15 or 20 years and making it look modern and useful. And it's one of the most highly used things on our website, so that's a huge win, I think. I'm excited.
I can't wait to see it, Rebecca, because we've looked to your current database of guides, I guess, and maybe your database of databases as well. So I can't wait to see what the new one looks like.
Yeah, probably if I'll email you.
Awesome. So I'll follow up on an example that I mentioned last time as well, and that is related to signage. So we heard in our last major survey, and we hear all the time from students that our buildings are just really difficult to navigate. And so we were able to implement some color-based and icon-based signage. And we've been able to extend that to our website with our Places to Study page. The same language and same icons we use in the signs around the building are represented in our website, and have done some nice color coding so people at a glance can see if a room is reservable or not reservable. We've gotten good feedback on that. And we've continued to kind of iterate and extend on that. So we now have 3 color zones of various spots in the library. We have what we call considerate study, we have collaborative study, and then we have absolute quiet study. We've extended that to create like a color-coded directory so people can come in and look at the directory right when they get in the building and see exactly by floor, by color code, where the purple zones are, so that's the absolute quiet space, and go directly to those spaces in our building, because we continue to hear from users that they spend time wandering the building trying to find their perfect study spot. So if we can pull it all in one place, both on our website and through a nice visual representation, it's a lot easier for them. So that's something that we've been able to iterate on and continue to improve.
My example is a little bit like Emily's in that it has to do with wayfinding and signs in the libraries. We have, as of less than a year ago, we put up some digital touch screens in one of our libraries, and we did usability testing, and the result of the usability tests were that what we wanted to happen happened. People could use them pretty well. but there was some label confusion. There are basically 4 things that people could do on the screen, and people would switch between 2 of them in this way that was confusing to them. And so the verb tense here is future tense. We are going to fix that and make what we think is a really good product even better.
Cool.
Well, we're out of time. Thanks so much to Rebecca, Josh, and Emily, as well as my co-moderators from the ACRL ULS Professional Development Committee. I would also like to thank Lois Sharp and Sophie Skinner from ACRL. Remember that we will send the link to the recording for this session when it is available. A reminder to please fill out the assessment instrument, a link to which has been posted in the chat window. The upcoming webinars from the ULS Professional Development Committee include free graphics, audio, and video for education on Wednesday, March 7th at 12 p.m. Central Time. The committee will provide more information about this program over the next few weeks, and we hope you'll join us for those. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone. This was fun. Enjoy your afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Bye.